Today's daf is daf Lamed Dalid, and we have to introduce again the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on daf Lamed Gimel Amid Beis. And the issue is about a Tomei who comes in contact with Kodesh. And Reish Lakish derives from a pasuk B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga in the parsha of Yoledes that as a result, the Tomei who comes in contact with Kodshim gets Malchus. And Rabbi Yochanan says he doesn't get Malchus because that posuk is referring to Truma, that there's a lav that a Tomei is not allowed to have contact with Truma. Now, Reish Lakish also understands that that posuk of V'chol Kodesh Tiga is written in the context of Truma, but he learns with the Kal V'chomer. The Torah is always more machmir in Kodshim than it is in Truma. But then the Gemara raises another issue because Reish Lakish seems to use that pasuk for the case of someone who is tamei and eats B'sar Kodesh. The Gemara goes on Daf Lamed Gimel Amid Beis to a whole discussion about how Reish Lakish can derive two different halachos and two different lavim from the same pasuk and derive the conclusion that not only if someone who's tummy eats kudshim does he get malchus, but even if he only touches kudshim, he gets malchus. And the Gemara at the end of Daf Lamed Gimel Beis quotes a brisa to support the shita of Reish Lakish. And the brisa is pretty outspoken about the fact that a person who's tummy who comes in contact with kodesh gets malchus. You might have thought the brisa says that maybe b'chol kodesh lo tiga is only if he eats the kodshim when he's tamei, but the brisa concludes that no, that pasuk should be taken literally as referring to someone who comes in contact with kodshim. And the Gemara introduces a brisa which has a hekesh. Now, what does this hekesh have? Makish kodesh lemigdosh. Ma migdosh davar sheyesh bo netilas neshama. Netilas neshama is another phrase for kares. Is af kodesh davar sheyesh bo netilas neshama. Just like if a tamei enters into the migdosh, he's chayiv kares. So too, if a tamei comes in contact with kodshim, he gets kares. Now, if it's nogea, so the question now becomes whether or not that hekesh is teaching me that even a person who is tomei and nogea b'kodesh gets kares. Gemara says that's impossible because nesius neshama mi'ika. There's no such thing as in the minds of anybody, whether it's like Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, that if a person touches kodshim and he's tamei, that he gets kares for that. Ela b'achila. The only possibility is to assume that this is referring to achila. So achila, according to Reish Lakish, and according to Rabbi Yochanan as well, is more chomer than negia. But whereas Rabbi Yochanan says negia is not even a lav, Reish Lakish has negia as a lav. So now the Gemara, which we want to start now, we'll count down from the top. 1, 2, 3 lines down from the top. Vakati mi boile, Reish Lakish still needs the pasuk for l'tamisha ochal basar kodesh lifnei zrika. We need a pasuk to indicate and derive the conclusion that if you have a korban and it's before zrika, that if a tamei goes ahead and eats from that korban before zrika, then he's chayav malchus, but he doesn't get kares. Now, this question of the Gemara is really based on a sugya earlier on Daf Lamed Gimel, where the Gemara says that if the Tomei eats the basar kosher before Zrika, he is chayiv kares, de itmar, and yet Reish Lakish says that Tomei she'ochal basar kosher Zrika, Reish Lakish amar loke, there's no chayiv kares, there's only malchus. Rabbi Yochanan amar eino loke, Rabbi Yochanan says there's no malchus. And the Gemara explains, Reish Lakish amar loke, Reish Lakish holds that if a Tomei eats basar kodesh before Zrika, he gets malchus, b'chol kodesh lo tiga. And the interpretation of Chazal in Torah Sheba'al Peh in this pasuk in the parsha of Yoledes is that she ate the kodshim before Zrika, and she was still tmeah. And the chiddush is that even before Zrika, there still is a violation of the law. Lo shno lifnei Zrika, lo shno liachar Zrika. Rabbi Yochanan eino loke, kidetoni bardala. So this is based on a brisa of bardala. Asya tuma, tumaso tumaso. We have Gzeir Shava of tumaso tumaso. Now, the case of tumaso in its original form is a Tomei who enters into the Migdash. And the second tumaso in this Gzeir Shava is referring to a Tomei who eats the Basar Kodesh. And the Gzeir Shava is going to teach me that just as a Tomei who enters into the Migdash, that's called Bias Migdash Betuma, in addition to violating a lav, we derive from that another conclusion that if a Tomei eats Basar Kodesh, that he also gets an onesh. He also violates a lav. Now, v'chi kosav, when the Torah speaks about giving a punishment for a Tomei who eats Kodesh, and we're going to derive that through Gzeir Shava with a Tomei who enters into the Migdash, that's liachar Zrika. So therefore, a Tomei who eats Basar Kodesh before Zrika, according to Rabbi Yochanan's logic, there's no basis for any sort of chiyuv malchus, because the Gzeir Shava here of tumaso is only addressing the case of a Tomei who ate from Basar Kodesh after the Zrika. Reish Lakish, on the other hand, understands the pasuk of V'chol Kodesh lo tiga as an azhara for a Tomei who eats Basar Kodesh before Zrika. And this, the Gemara says, is problematic because back on Daf Lamed Gimel, we said that pasuk was referring to, a Tomei who eats the Basar Kodesh after Zrika. So the Gemara explains the following. Im kain, if the pasuk only refers to li'achar Zrika, lema kra b'kodesh, then the pasuk should have been written as lotiga b'kodesh. There's an extra word in this pasuk which is a ribui. My bechol kodesh. Why the extra word bechol? Shma minotarti. This is teaching me two different lavim. One is when she eats bituma, the basar kodesh, after the Zrikas Hadam, and one is before the Zrikas Hadam. So that's the extra ribui that Reish Lakish derives from bechol kodesh. Okay, Gufa. Now, at this point in the Gemara, we have already established a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and Tomei she'achal b'sar kodesh lifnei Zrika, Reish Lakish amar loka, Rabbi Yochanan amar eino loka, amar Abaye machlokas betumas haguf, aval betumas basar divrei hakol loka. Even Rabbi Yochanan argues, Abaye, in the case where the basar itself is Tomei, and a tahar will eat the basar, he gets malchus. So Rabbi Yochanan only disagrees and alleviates the violator from malchus in the case where he is tamei, which is called Tomas Haguf, and he ate kodshim before the zrika. But if the case is that the basar itself contracted tuma, and then the tahar eats the basar kodesh, which is tamei, then even Rabbi Yochanan agrees that he's chayiv malchus. And Abai supports this with a logical derivation. The Yom Kra, the pasuk says, "Veha basar." Now, apparently, the vav of Veha basar is a superfluous letter that's added as a ribui. And what is the ribui teaching me? So, according to Abaye, the veha basar is l'rabos eitzim ulevona de la bnei achila ninu. Meaning that there were eitzim that were brought on the maroch in order to raise a fire so that we could burn the Avarim and the Emurim, and the Levona, in the case of the Lechem Haponim, was brought on Shabbos in connection with the Lechem Haponim, as a sort of an addition to the Lechem Haponim. However, Levona is really some sort of I guess you'd call it a spice. And these items are not eaten, they're not edible, and yet they can be makabel tumah. Now that might be strange, because if it's not an ochel, then how could it be makabel tumah? Furthermore, it's very strange that Abaye is claiming, based on the extra word v'abasar, that even in the cases of eitzim and levona, if they contracted tumah, you get malchus for eating them. I mean, it's not roy lachila. And that's what the Abaye adds here, ve'afilu hachi rabinu kra. And even the fact that these are not normally eaten, nevertheless, the pasuk comes to include them in something that cannot be eaten if they contract tumah. Now, normally, if you eat something that's not edible, then that's called shelo kederech achila, and you would not be chayiv for such an achila. Furthermore, levona, which is a kind of a spice, and even more so eitzim, these are not ochlim. So this is very strange that these items are makabel tumah. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. Now, in any event, if the ribui is for something that's not an ochel, if it's makabel tumah and it was eaten by a tar, then you chayev and you get malchus. Then kal v'chomer, how much more so something that is edible, like for example the basar, even though it's before zrika, nevertheless for sure with the kal v'chomer you're going to be chayev malchus. But Rava doesn't like it. Rava on machlokas betumas haguf, aval betumas basar divrei kol eino loke. So Rava goes to the other extreme, and he says that even Reish Lakish, who holds that if a tamei eats the basar kodesh before zrika gets malchus, he admits that in the case of tumas basar, if a tahar eats basar that was nitma, he certainly doesn't get malchus. My timer, and now Rava has to justify his conclusion that even Reish Lakish would agree that if a tar eats Bisar Kodesh Bituma, that's called tumas basar. There's no malchus. So the Gemara says, in the name of Rava, Kevan to lo karina be vitum also all of the nichrasa lo karina be v'abasar asher yiga b'chol tomei lo yeyochel. In the case of the basar, we cannot apply the principle, or shall we say the pasuk of vitum also all of the nichrasa, because the pasuk of vitum also all of, as we saw before in the Gzeres Shava, is formulated only after the Zrika Sadam. So now in the case of before the Zrika Sadam, as far as the basar is concerned, if a person eats the basar and he's tameh, which is called v'tumaso olav, so he would not be chayav. Only in the case where it was after the Zrika, then he's chayav. And therefore, when the pasuk says "Va'abasar asher yiga b'chol tameh lo ye'achel," which prohibits eating the basar b'tuma, and that's in the pasuk right before that. So we're not going to include in that pasuk the basar before the zrika. He says here, when the Torah has two psukim that are contiguous, one next to the other, it limits the azhara. In this case, when we're talking about the meat contracting tumah, and the chiyuv kares is referring to only meat that could have been consumed because there was already zrika. Therefore, if somebody eats the basa that became tameh before the zrika, he doesn't get malchus, because the pasuk itself is only referring to a case of the tumas basar after the zrika. So the Gemara now raises an objection to Rava. V'amar mar, ve'habasar. We had the extra vav, and we already established that the extra vav is a ribuy l'rabos eitzim u'levona. And these are makabel tuma, and they have the status of oklin. And if you eat the eitzim or the levona after they became tameh, and you're tar, you get malchus for that. Now, the truth is that, as we said over and over again, this wood, or in the case of frankincense, this levona is not roy lachila, right? That was the language of the Gemara, lav b'nei achila ninu. So therefore, the Gemara now assumes, which was our intuitive feeling about this, that if a tameh would eat these objects, these edibles, they're not really edible, and therefore there would be no chiyuv kares, and yet the Torah says you get malchus for them. So Rava was assuming that if you don't get kares, if you're not chayv kares for eating the basa tameh, then there's no lav, and you don't get malchus. But that's not true. We see that in the cases of eitzim levana, even though there's no chiyuv kares, but nevertheless there is a chiyuv malchus. So malchus l'chud and kares l'chud. Now the Gemara gives the following answer: Hochamay askinon. What is the case of levona and eitzim, where the Torah says you get malchus for eating them if they contracted tumah? Kigon shekodshu b'kli. Okay, this is heavy kodshim. Now, this requires that we know all of Maseches Zevachim in one shot, but just on a just on a surface level, there's something called Kiddush Kli. When you put something that's chulin into a Kli Kodesh, and the very fact that it enters into the Kli Kodesh is Makadesh it, and it becomes sanctified. So let's say, for example, when they took the wood for the Mizbeach, they would scoop it up in a shovel, which was a klisharis, or the levona in the bazich, and those were the spoons that brought the levona into the onto the shulchan of the clay of the lechem aponim. So there was also a klisharis. That's going to be makadish again in the case of eitzim and in the case of levona. And nasa kemisha karvu kol matirov. In other words, there is no zrikas dam, obviously, in the cases of eitzim and levona, but the equivalent to zrikas dam does exist, and that's because there was kiddush beklishares. So just like the dam is received in a klishares, and once the dam is applied to the mizbeach, that's called a matir, and then let's say the Kohen could eat the basar of chatos, and the Israel could eat the basar of shlomim, and that's called a matir. So too, in the cases of eitzim and levona, where there is no zrikas hadam, but they were sanctified in a klishares, whether it's in the spoons or the bazichen. Therefore, there's a chiv kares if he eats it when he's tummy. That's called tumas haguf. Desnan, we learned in a Mishnah, Kol sheyesh lo matirin, mishekarvu matirov. There's a chiv kares if you're tame and you eat it after the zrikas adam. That's called mishekarvu matirov. Kol she'ein lo matirin, but if you have something that doesn't have a matir, there is no zrikas dam, then at what point would there be a chiv kares if you ate it betuma? Mishekarish bekli. Itmar hamala every behemot mea al gabi mizbeach. If a person takes various limbs of a non-kosher animal and he places on the mizbeach, Reish Lakish Omer Loka, you get malchus for that. Rav Yochanan Omer Eino Loka. Reish Lakish Omer Loka, why? Tahora in Tmea lo. The Torah says that a kosher animal is allowed to go on the mizbeach. And from the fact that the Torah says a kosher animal, lav habomachal esse lokin alav. And this is a sugi at the end of Makis, that Reish Lakish is of the opinion that if you derive a lav, a lotas from an essay, then it has the status of a lotas, and you get malchus. Rabbi Yochanan ain't a lokin, because lav habomachal esse ain't lokin alav. It's only an essay. It's not a lav. We don't give malchus for the violation of an essay. A person doesn't take a lulav or sit in the sukkah. He doesn't get malchus for that. Mosif Rabbi Yirmiyah, the Brisa says, Osa sochelu, this can be a kashem reish lakish, v'lo behemoth me'ah, v'lav b'machal esei. So therefore, when the Torah says that you're allowed to eat a kosher animal, but you're not allowed to eat a non-kosher animal, then that's called, in the Lashon of the Brisa, lav b'machal esei, and has the status of an essay. You don't get malchus. Again, we'll get malchus for eating a non-kosher animal for a different reason, because the Torah says lo sochlo kol nevela, etc., whatever it says in each pasuk, but not because of osa sachelu. Osa sachelu could not generate malchus, and therefore at this point the Gemara is going to offer a whole different presentation of the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Amalei Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yirmiyah, Asber Aloch. I'm going to explain the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Be'evrei behemot mea kuli alma lo pligi. That in a case where he brings a varim of a non-kosher animal onto the mizbeach, for sure he doesn't get malchus. Even Reish Lakish agrees that he doesn't get malchus. And now, in the context of Rabbi Yaakov, Reish Lakish, who was the Machmir until now becomes the Mekil, and the reverse regarding Rabbi Yochanan. Bechaya, right? Chaya is we call it an undomesticated animal like a deer, a tzvi, ayal. So the Torah says that we only bring behema on the mizbeach, not ayal. The Yitmar, Rabbi Yochanan Amar over b'esei, Reish Lakish already over below klum. The machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is about a chaya that was brought on the mizbeach, and this chaya is a kosher animal, but it's not a behema. And the Torah says bring a behema on the mizbeach, and we're going to derive an essay that if you bring a chaya on the mizbeach, you violate an essay. Comes along Reish Lakish, he says, no, you didn't violate anything. Rabbi Yochanan Amar over essay behema in chayalo. The Torah says, take a kosher behema and bring it on the mizbeach, like for example, tzon and bakar and sheep and goats and the like, but not an undomesticated wild species of a chaya like a deer. Reish Lakish already over all below kluma hula mitzvah. The Torah, when it says that you bring a flock of sheep, take sheep and bring it on the mizbeach, that's only the mitzvah is concerned. Meaning, the best, if all things are equal, then bring a behema. But if, let's say, you have a desire to bring a deer onto the mizbeach, then you're allowed to do so. Mosiv Rava doesn't understand Reish Lakish, who allows you to bring a chaya on the mizbeach. The Brisa says, "Ilu nemar kara l'Hashem behema." If the Torah would have said behema, the word behema has two different meanings to it. Sometimes the word behema means all animals, including undomesticated wild animals like a chaya, and sometimes behema comes to say a behema like a flock of sheep to the exclusion of a chaya. So the Brisa says, Korban Lashem behema, I could have interpreted the word behema as a generic term. That includes even what? Even a chaya. I'll give you another example. It says, Zosa behema shetochelu shor, se, ksavim, and se, izim, ayal utzvi, are chayos. You see the word behema includes even a chaya, Talmud Lomer, bakar v'tzon. The Torah went out of its way to tell us that you only bring bakar and tzon on the mizbeach. Bakar b'tzon amarti l'chavalo chaya, to the exclusion of a chaya. Yachal lo yavi v'yim hevi kosh. I might think the Torah is only telling you l'mitzvah. It's best to bring a domesticated animal, but you could also bring a chaya. No. I might say that, okay, the Torah says bring a behema, but if you want, you could even bring a chaya. So the Rebbe tells the Talmud to bring him chitin, and now the Talmud brings him not only chitin, brings him sa'orim. That's fine. He's not violating the word of his Rebbe. He's only bringing something extra. The Rebbe doesn't lose anything by getting not only chitin, but also sa'orim. And the kosher, therefore, I would come to the conclusion that if you bring a chaya on the mizbeach as a korban, it's kosher. Talmud lomer bakar v'tzon, marti l'chol, mazedom l'talmud she'omer lo rabo al tavili el achitin vehevi lo chitin siorim. For some reason, the Rebbe doesn't want siorim. Maybe because Sodi Matanas Yichya, he needs the chitin, he doesn't need siorim. And the Talmud brought him not only chitin, brought him siorim. Sheina mosvel dvarv and mavel dvarv. He violates the word of his Rebbe. And here also, when the Torah says behema meaning tzon ubakar, it means tzon ubakar, but don't bring me a chaya on the mizbeach. Uposel, and therefore if he brings a chaya on the mizbeach, it's posel, and that would support Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish. It's tufta, the Reish Lakish tufta, and this brisa ends up as a stira to Reish Lakish, and we cannot reconcile.